So today we'll be looking at sexual reproduction in plants. You can quickly pause on that. That's the outcomes we'll be covering in this lesson. Okay, so sexual reproduction in plants. So like sexual reproduction in animals, it also requires the successful fusion of male and female gametes. That's what it's all about. We need the male and female gametes to fuse to form a zygote, as we said last time. So now this is more difficult in plants, obviously because they can't move around to look for or find a mate. So they rely on external agents, also called pollinating agents. And examples of those are wind, the birds and bees. Now just related to that, they also rely on these external agents, like wind, water, animals, to disperse the seeds later on. Just keep that in mind, but we'll focus on actually making the seeds now. So as early angiosperms evolved, that's a fancy word for flowering plants. So as early angiosperms evolved, they gained features that resulted in more successful pollination. So what are these features that help with successful pollination? Flowers. So flowers are the reproductive organs of plants. So to understand sexual reproduction in plants, we need to understand flowers and their parts and be able to name them. So flowering plants are called angiosperms. Okay, starting to look at parts of a flower. Now some of I guess the most obvious one we would know would be petal. So leaves that are modified, so they actually were leaves, but they're modified or they're different to increase the chance of pollination. They're often brightly colored and scented, meaning that they've got a smell to attract pollinators. The shape of them also helps the pollinators kind of walk in and enter the flower. Sepal, that's another modified leaf. Its main job is to protect the unopened bud. Once the flower's opened, it's not really doing much, but when the flower is forming, the sepal is the thing that covers up the developing bud to protect it. Now, the carpel is the female parts of the flower, and the stamen is the male parts of a flower. So it's not simply that there are male flowers and there are different female flowers. Often flowers have both male and female parts, or male and female as we have called them. And to help you remember, with stamen, just remember that stamen has men in it. So stamen is the male part, carpel is the female part. Yeah, and I've got, depending on the type of flower, it could be only female, it could be only male, or often both. So zooming in a bit closer on the carpel, which was the female part, we have the stigma, which is the sticky kind of top surface of the flower where the pollen sticks. So that's where it wants to kind of receive the pollen that's come from somewhere else. So it can be small and smooth if insects are the pollinators, or it can be very large and feathered if wind is the pollinators. The reason for that is if insects are the pollinators, they're going to be right there in the flower. If we think of bees, for example, kind of like rubbing all over it, it doesn't need to be big to get the pollen from the bee. Whereas if the flower is relying on wind flying the pollen by, and it wants to kind of receive that, it's kind of like a big feathered thing to try to catch the pollen as it's going. That's why it would need to be large in the case of wind being the vector. So now style, the style that simply joins the stigma to the ovary. And then the ovary is where ovules are formed, and we can think of the ovules are kind of like the little flower eggs. We're not going to call them eggs, we call them ovules, but that's kind of what you can think they are. So parts of a flower, let's look at the stamen a bit more now. So at the very top of the stamen, we have the anther. So that is where the pollen grains are formed. And the filament. The filament is just the stalk that holds the anther. Now, depending on, again, how the flower is pollinated, there will be differences in what it looks like. So if the filament is very short, then that's usually because the pollinators are insects that are kind of walking in and getting all in amongst it. Whereas if they're very, very long, the idea is they'll have a really long filament to be exposing the anther into the air so wind can blow the pollen away. Now, not part of the stamen, but just another thing that we'll talk about it briefly is just the receptacle, and that we'll just call that the reinforced base of the flower that supports all the other reproductive structures. So again, that's just showing you everything in a slightly different looking picture all in one screen, just kind of highlighting the male parts and female parts, or the stamen and the pistil, where each of the stamen and the pistil is made up of smaller parts. And again, just another picture you can kind of pause on and look at. One slightly different thing here that we're adding in is the inside the ovary, it's showing an ovule, which is kind of like the individual egg, but I should stop calling it that. We'll just call it an ovule. When that is fertilized, it will become a seed. So this just shows you some real world examples, not just diagrams. It's probably the right time of year if you can go out and find a flower and cut it open and have a look, knock yourself out. Just shows you a couple of examples of what this would look like in real flowers. So let's talk about pollination and fertilization. They're slightly different. So we'll understand how they're related and how they're different. So to start the process, the male gametes inside the pollen must be carried from the anthers to the stigma. So this process is called pollination. And I guess that also we know enough now to maybe understand why we're calling some parts of the flowers, I guess, male and some parts of them female, because I guess in terms of the male and talking about pollen being a male thing, I guess that's because it's the gamete that is moving externally and is trying to move to the other organism to be kind of received inside it, whereas the female one is the one that essentially has the ovule inside that has to receive the pollen. So that's, I guess, why we're calling it male and female, but it's not male and female as we understand in animals. Okay, so basically pollination is simply getting the pollen from the anther to the stigma. That's pollination. But after pollen, more needs to happen for fertilization. So after pollination, the male gamete is then carried down the style to the ovule in the ovary. So it's only then we get fertilization, where the male gamete is fused with the female ovule. And once the fertilized ovule, then starts developing into a seed. Now I'll just quickly highlight the difference in a different way. So let's look at my little picture here. We've got a stamen here with the anther at the top. Then we have our female parts here. If we just assume we've got a pollen grain, so the pollen grain getting to the stigma, getting that far, that is pollination. So we can stop at that point and say, right, that is pollination. But we're nowhere near fertilization yet, because we have the male gamete up here and we have the female gamete down here. They're nowhere near coming together or fusing, so it's not fertilization yet. This is only pollination once we're up here. So what has to happen for fertilization is once the pollen is received at the stigma, it forms a little pollen tube. Let's imagine that's a little tube. The pollen, the pollen kind of moves down that tube to eventually to find an ovule. Once the pollen fuses with an ovule together, that is then when we have fertilization. Pollination is only when we get the pollen just to the top. Hopefully that is clear. Just go back to the presentation. Okay, so the fertilized ovule, once it's fertilized, that is what develops into a seed. And usually the rest of the ovary is what will develop into a fruit. Usually we think of fruit as the type of fruits that we eat, but the fruit can be kind of any kind of part that is surrounding a seed. Doesn't have to be the fruit that we'd buy from the supermarket. And I've just got a little link there. If you want to watch another little video on this, I've got a link there, or just search YouTube for the fertilization and post-fertilization changes in the flower. Don't memorize. If you put that into YouTube, the top example will give you another good little video that talks about this. So now let's just quickly talk about cross-pollination and self-pollination. So plants are dependent on wind, water, and animals to carry their pollen. So cross-pollination is when pollen from the anther of one plant pollinates the stigma of another plant or a different plant. Now, this obviously results in greater genetic variation. Self-pollination is when pollen from the anther of a plant pollinates the stigma of the same plant. In this example, there's less genetic variation. That's obviously not as good when we think about evolution and variation being a requirement for evolution. So there's a chance that if a selection pressure comes, there'll be one type of variation that can survive. So that's not the case with self-pollination, but it may be better than nothing. So, and we've also got self-pollination. It requires less energy because they don't have to attract pollinators. So plants that usually will rely on self-pollination, they're not wasting their energy on making pretty colorful flowers, on making a nice smell, on making sugar-rich nectar that they're just giving away to all for the sake of pollination. So they can save some energy with that. Now, just looking a little bit again, we've kind of hinted at some of this, but we're just kind of showing it in a different way to highlight the differences. So we're going to see different types of flowers depending on if they are pollinated by the wind or if they're pollinated by animals. So, for example, those pollinated by wind, the flowers are small, green. They don't have to be big. They don't have to be colorful. They're not trying to attract anything. They're odorless, and often with reduced or even absent petals. I mean, grasses, for example, are an example of where there's not kind of often pretty big flowers, that no petals even. So they'll have long anthers. The idea is kind of like have a long anther that's sticking the pollen out into the wind, so the wind can catch it to blow it away. And the pollen then make lots of it, and it's kind of light, so it can be carried by the wind. Stigmas are usually large and spread out. It's like they're very spread out because they're trying to catch the pollen that's kind of blowing by. We then compare that to pollination by an animal. It's more effective, as you can imagine. You got something taking it from point A straight to point B. We're not just kind of relying on the chance of something blowing by. So it's more effective. Pollen is deposited on the correct flower. There's less kind of pollen waste. We don't need to make heaps and heaps of pollen just for one to work. Now, flower scent, color, markings, shape, and nectar are all important to attract animals. But remember, this requires extra energy. And just highlighting again the point that with a lot of these, wind, water, and animals also help in the dispersal of seeds. So after we have fertilization and making a seed, that's often a strategy where, with fruits are the best example, where they'll make a nice tasty fruit for an animal to come and eat the fruit. The animal eats the seeds as well. The animal moves somewhere else, deposits the seeds, and the seeds can grow elsewhere. It helps the plant to try to spread out and have its seeds kind of try and grow somewhere distant to where it is now. But helping it spread out means a larger environment. It's not competing. It helps to ensure continuity of the species. So that's what we've got now. Thank you very much.